Welcome everybody to today's Artist Talk. I have the pleasure to welcome Dave Gussak, who is a professor of the Graduate Art Therapy program in Florida State University. I met David in 2004 when I first learned about his research in art therapy in the prison system. And it seemed to me very appropriate to have him bring point of view from research in the same topic as we discuss the exhibition From the Inside.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So I know that you just wrote this book and I was reading about it. I've read it all, Art and Art Therapy Within Prison. And we're gonna be showing you an image of how the book looks right now. I know you have a lot to say, so I may just pass you the mic and let's dig in.
Oh, certainly. Boy, that's quite a wide open invitation to speak. To start with, I've been involved with art therapy in prisons and various correctional and forensic environments for almost 30 years now. And I've had an opportunity to see the value of art and art therapy within the correctional environment and how valuable it is, particularly with helping recreate identity along with a number of other various psychological and mental health benefits.
It's interesting when I was reading the book, the term identity and what you mean by that, because as we were referring to the artists, all of artists participating, be there visual artists or the poets or the artists that wrote the poems, even if it didn't matter where they come from, where the residence is, being a prison or being a home, we were referring to everyone as artists. So can you tell us more what identity means?
So what I found is that once the identity of inmate is taken on by the person who's residing in a correctional institution, they hold on to that identity. It's reinforced through the dynamics that occur inside, and it continues to perpetuate even after they get out, if they get out or if they parole. And so from my perspective, this is the crux of why recidivism is so blatant, why we see the increase of the revolving door once they're in the correctional environment, because they can't shake off that label. They can't change that identity. What I find to be most valuable in these environments is our ability to help them reframe and restructure and recreate new labels and new identities that will allow them to then survive when they get out. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that identity has to be one of artist, but it does have to be one of a person. It has to be one as being seen as human and as humane, that we de-objectify, we demarginalize, we rehumanize this person, because the very act of creating demonstrates the humanity within them.
What you're saying is really interesting of the exercise of the exhibition that we had at Bailey Contemporary Arts, From the Inside, because what we did, we received the poems written by the people incarcerated. And I asked artists in my close network to select one that resonated with them and to create a new artwork or pick some of the artworks that related to that. So that in a way created this bond. And as we had these artist talks, they really related to another person, to another human that also created. And in a way they were touching on similar issues, be either by poem or by artwork. We're humans, we deal and we feel the same thing. So that's incredibly interesting. I think that we can touch on the cover of your book because what caught my attention when I was reading it is how he feels, the artist of this image, that he needed to show someone that is stronger than he is to be able to survive in the prison world.
I find it interesting and gratifying that you focused on the image that's on the cover of the new book. That actually came about from an interaction that I had within months before the book was to go to the publisher. I'm going to back up a little because I think you said some things that were so pertinent, and that involved the very dynamic of interactionism. I'm a therapist, and I begin and end with a psychological understanding of the dynamics within people, right, as a clinician. But I've also, over the years, really have seen that what fills the gaps in my relationship with my populations and the value of the art making within the correctional environment is seen through a symbolic and social interactionist perspective, that the very act of interacting with somebody helps recreate and redefine new identities and new senses of self. Labeling theory has emerged from social interactionism, and in essence, what we're trying to do is recreate new labels. So I love your dynamic and that directive that you were offering, because what that does is the very act of accepting that art piece from them and accepting the value of what they have to say and what they have to do, in essence, shows that you're accepting them. And that by accepting them, you're accepting them as an equal, as a person. And that is so valuable in helping shift that hierarchical dynamic that exists inside. Now, flash forward, and I ended up having, or wanting to, I should say, this was quite a wonderful experience. I had gone to Colorado, Florence, Colorado, because for the past several years, I was consulting for a colleague of mine. His name is Justin Reddick, who was at one time an associate chaplain and later the artist facilitator for the for the Federal Correctional Institution in Florence, Colorado. It is known as the Supermax of the United States. It's probably one of the most dangerous places I'd ever been inside. It really houses the worst of the worst, if you had to put a label on it. And of course, I'm trying not to do that, but that's essentially what it is. And I had the good fortune of sitting in a session where Justin was meeting with these gentlemen, where they were showing their art that they had on exhibition the month before. And what was supposed to be a 45-minute meeting ended up being a little over 2 hours, where I heard these seven or eight people tell me their stories and tell me who they were through their art. And what was great, what was gratifying, is they said everything better than I could have. So they were talking about how their art was accepted by somebody, and that gave them a new sense of self. That this person who created this dynamic piece on the cover was for the first time seen by someone else. That it was reflecting what his own experiences were like, that you get a sense of who he was before and during this time, rather than this mask that he keeps in place in order to survive inside. We're having people who are creating poetry who are really expressing themselves in rather profound ways, in very simple language, but it was their language. And I ended up, the reason this was gratifying and it was so fortuitous is that, you know, it allowed me to scrap the entire beginning of the book that I'd written. And I ripped up the first chapter and I rewrote a whole new chapter, the introduction, which was about this experience. And I used their words, not mine, because they said it so much better. And it really was about how they were seen as people.
Dave, as I was going through your book, I saw these images from prisoners in Guantanamo, and I would love for you to share the story about how the images came to be. And I'm asking you this question because there was a connection that I made. I know that in South Florida, mainly in Miami, the artists there are making a big case against climate change. And I know that it's about the oceans, and there's a lot of artistry and images that are coming to call attention to that. So there is a connection in terms of how artists view the ocean as an inspiration to call attention. So can you share with us about those Guantanamo images and how they came to be?
Of course, I'd be happy to. I think this will also help kind of distinguish the notion between personal and universal symbols. I think that's what's kind of exciting about this conversation. I happened upon this story of the artist from Guantanamo purely by chance. Of all things, I was listening to an NPR interview with Erin Thompson, who is I believe in art theft attorney up at a professor up at John Jay College up in New York. And she had come into possession of a number of art pieces that came from several of the inmates, or I should say the detainees of Guantanamo Bay that were being held there by the United States government. And I was fascinated by this work, and I was fascinated by the controversy that came out about this show. And so I contacted her on a whim. I looked her up, and sure enough, she responded, and we had a wonderful conversation. And what emerged was that these detainees, and I will continue calling them detainees because they've never been put on trial, they've never been sentenced, they're being held there without any real conclusion about why they're there or what they're there for. But they're being held in Guantanamo Bay. They all came from the Middle East. They had never seen such large expanses of water before. They have never seen the ocean. They've never seen the sea. They were from the desert. They were transported, essentially blindfolded, to the middle of the ocean off the coast of Cuba in Guantanamo Bay. But they had still never seen the outside because there were tarps that were covering all the windows around this building. However, there was a threat of a hurricane coming through there. So for 3 days, they had to remove those tarps. And for the first time, these detainees, these gentlemen, saw the ocean and they were overwhelmed by it. And so they felt compelled to paint. And so they did a series of paintings that depicted their own relationships, their own sense of personhood in regards to this large, expansive natural experience. And the attorneys for these detainees saw these pieces and contacted Erin Thompson, who the attorneys were friends with, and Erin didn't know what to do, but she collected the works. She decided to put on an exhibition of these works, and it was called Ode to the Sea. And it was an overwhelming, overpowering show. And what that allowed us to do was, once again, change our own script, that these weren't terrorists that were two-dimensional, objectified villains, but rather, first off, we're now hearing their story. We don't know who they are. We don't know why they're in there. But we're also recognizing that they're real people creating real wonderful works and tried to come to grips to where their own place is in nature. And as a separate conversation, there was a great deal of controversy about this show because how dare we put on a show of artwork, championing the terrorists. But on the other hand, there were many people that came to the show and thanked Erin for saying, this is really important work. There was a correctional officer from there who saw the show and said, this is wonderful. I'm glad you showed these pieces. But in relation to what the water means, now, again, as a therapist, my job would be to talk to the people that did the artwork, to find out what the water meant to them and how important that is. Given that I wasn't their therapist and I wasn't an art therapist in this situation, I can only surmise based on my own reaction, my own feelings. But these are people that are feeling overwhelmed by the circumstances that surround them. And what makes us feel the most vulnerable and the most diminutive, if you will, but to be in the middle of a huge expansive body of water, to be taken, sometimes losing control because you're at the whim of nature and you're at the whim of the sea. And here are these people that are capturing this sense of desolation and helplessness and hopelessness amongst these environmental images. Now, is that what it's about? I don't know. But I do know that's what I get out of it. And the reason I say that there's a wonderful distinction between personal and universal symbology is that water as a universal concept is about so many different things to so many people. But Jung would say and argue that it's all comes back to this, the unconscious. Personal was that each of these pieces means something very specific to that person who created it. And to find out more about that, it compels us to want to know more about their story.
This is incredibly powerful, and we're kind of reaching the end, or where we need to end our conversation. But listening to the conversation that you had at the Gadsden Art Center, you cannot summarize, and I know it's really hard for all the years of research that you've done, but what is, in a few sentences, the power of the arts in art therapy in the prison? What is the take that we can get from here?
I'm so glad you asked that. The reason I find art therapy to be so much more valuable and so much more reliable, if I could, than other therapies, is that you're talking about an environment that any disclosure of weakness and vulnerability can be or may be taken advantage of by others, either by the other inmates, by the environment, by the institution. And so people are hesitant about really disclosing their own vulnerabilities and weaknesses. The art allows us to work behind the mask without pulling it aside. It allows them to reach a therapeutic trajectory without revealing these weaknesses and vulnerabilities to others. It also allows an opportunity to escape from the environment. Now, of course, the word escape is taken in different contexts, but in this context, it's a good thing. But it allows them to get away from what is going on around them to be able to start rebuilding a sense of wellness. It also allows us to communicate with them and have them communicate with us when words are not often available. We have such issues inside with illiteracy and organicity and some neurological impairments that sometimes words are just not available or not enough. And the art allows us to communicate with them when beyond those words. And through all of our research and through all of the interactions we've had, we've seen how art and art therapy is valuable in increasing mood and increasing locus of control and increasing anger management and increasing problem solving and socialization, that there's all of these benefits simply by engaging in the art process.
Well, thank you so much for putting all that into perspective. I mean, it's really interesting, and it's been a learning curve for me to engage into this exhibition that I plan, and I had to find ways to learn about this specific theme. And I will follow you to make sure that there's more research into this and what the future will bring in this topic. So I thank you so much for accepting my invitation to bring this perspective on research into the topic and into the exhibition. And I thank everybody who tuned in for the Artist Talk today, and keep tuned for the next Artist Talk in a week. Thank you so much.